Right, so I'm back this time on a Zoom call with Matthew Trenhaile. Thanks again, Matthew. Your original Betting People interview went down really well, and we've got a whole slew of questions that people have set. So if you're, as there's so many, if you're ready, without any further ado, we'll just crack on. First of all, Ferguson Grant, Fergie, sent me 6 questions via Messenger. So I'll start on these first of all because people would have seen these. First of all, will the Inside Betting podcast be returning?
Never say never, but it is unlikely. And I think part of the problem for me was that I wanted the content to be completely non-time specific, really. I didn't want to do tips or previews or anything like that. I wanted to do, I suppose, general purpose betting information. And one thing I found is that every day or every week at least, I'm kind of picking up new information and new stuff. And the consequence is that I become angry about stuff that now becomes outdated. And I think I'm too lazy to re-record the podcast or edit it. So there's things now where I think, like the good example, I think the best example one was the staking episode I did. And there's already several other things that I wanted to add to that now. And I thought to myself, I'm never going to be completely done with these. And I don't want to be in that, this is tragic, but I don't want to be in that situation where someone comes up to me at ICE in a year's time and says, you idiot, like, you know, it doesn't work like that. And I'll be like, oh, I know that now, but I didn't at the time I was recording the podcast. So yeah, I hope to make more appearances on shows like your own and so on. But I don't think that me putting out my own stuff is likely in the near future anyway.
Okay, next question from him is, do you recommend any articles or books within the gambling space?
Not many is the truth. Vast majority of my personal education has come through university white papers that I've found over the years via either JSTOR or Google Scholar or one of the other places they're kept. And often very generic search terms such as sport forecasting, sport predictions, these kind of things. That generally tends to be the best source of my knowledge. I find that if you really want to work into the mechanics of, they're almost better for bookmakers than punters a little bit, I think. But, I think there's a lot of value for bettors as well, as Joseph Buchdahl's series of books. I think a lot of people feel like Joseph doesn't give you like the keys to the city, like of how to make instant money. But I think there's so much to learn within those books. I'm currently 3/4 of the way through his latest one. And there's just so much information within there that, he's written an entire book about Monte Carlo simulation, essentially. It's a decent sized book. And yet there's so much information for those people who really want to get into the nitty gritty that are valuable. I mean, just the section he does on the US election, where he talks about how the sub-derivative markets, so the state-by-state markets, which is generally where sharp money is, aggregated as a better predictor of to win the presidential election market than the actual presidential election market is itself. Just like, to some people, what I've just said may sound utterly boring, but to me, his series of books are very much what I like reading. I recently read Conquering Risk by Elie Fustel, I think that's how you pronounce his name, who was a prominent contributor on the SBR forum as Justin7, I think it is. And he also works as a consultant for Pinnacle for a time. That book is good. The financial trading stuff is not great, in my opinion, but the sports stuff is interesting, and especially interesting for those who want to get a window into US sports and the conversions between different spread lines and total lines. I think he does a good job on that. And probably my favorite book at the moment is not specifically betting, but so Jack Swagger does the Market Wizards books, and his most recent one, which I think might be called Unknown Market Wizards, he basically talks to a lot of essentially prop traders who you wouldn't have heard, not Warren Buffett's of the world, these are not big hedge fund managers necessarily, but people who are traded, and the parallels between what they're doing and betting is very clear to me, and it's really interesting. And it even has an interview, what I find also an interview with a financial trader there, who's I think he's a Czech Republic guy, and he has an enormous edge, seemingly. He does all the metrics on his trading history, long trade, like 10-year trading career or something like that. and he's absolutely rocket scientist, and yet he insists on just trading the amount to make the amount he needs to live, like makes like 30,000 euros a year or whatever. And it's like, because I find one of the funny things about betting is you'll often hear the story, if the guy was so good, why is he not making infinite money and retiring? And there are a lot of different people in the world, a lot of different risk attitudes and mentalities. But I found that a really interesting interview within that book. So there'll be new stuff always that comes to mind, but those are the things that recently I've been reading that I've enjoyed.
Okay, it's third question. Views on a minimum bet law and the odds on it happening in the UK, I assume he means.
So I love the intent behind minimum bet law. It's not the way I would do it. So I think the moment you post a minimum bet law, you create a ceiling. So if you say lay to lose 2K, it means that everyone then completely pivots their product and offering around that. Unlikely. And if they do move above 2K for certain high profile races, they'll feel anchored towards that 2K. So something they could offer 10K lay to lose, they'll offer 5 just because they psychologically anchored towards this limit. My personal preference for a rule or law, legislation, whatever you want to call it, would be all customers have to receive the same limits, the same prices on a given event. So if you want to lay to lose 100 quid, well, there's going to be another bookmaker who's going to outcompete you. If you want to offer huge margins, there's going to be a bookmaker who's going to outcompete you. The only rule is every customer gets the same product. I remember when they introduced the lay to lose laws in Australia, there were horrible stories of people logging in, and they would have 2 people logged into the same site side by side, and one saw a book of like 3% a runner, and one saw a book of 1% a runner, and stuff like that. It's like, that's horrendous in my opinion. But yeah, all I would ask is that everyone is treated equally. And I think the moment you have to offer the same limits to everyone, it makes bookmakers think more creatively, more dynamically. So should I raise my limits as we get closer to post or kickoff, whatever it is? Can I offer World Cup at 500K, but maybe I should only be offering, like I've been offering, Albanian second league at like to lose a K. Is that the right strategy? Maybe should we lose 250 for all I know? Maybe it's not that. People get very much trapped in this middle range. And the reality is that in betting, the range should vary massively between opening price and closing. And the range should also vary massively between different qualities of events, or rather different quality of pricing, in my opinion. So the minimum bet laws, I don't think really encourage creative thinking by bookmakers. And I think they're also hard to get. It feels to tell people you've got to risk. This has to be your risk appetite. That is what you must have the risk appetite for in order to be a bookmaker. Doesn't feel right. Whereas the idea of treat everyone the same, that appeals to me.
Okay, so I'll go back to some more of Grant's in a bit. This is from Anthony Kaminskis. Which gamblers have you dealt with that you admire most, and why?
I don't think it's right to share names, unfortunately, specifically. I can say how I know them and what they do, I guess. But I think if I go through my career mentally, I can think of different people who I've particularly admired. So one would have been the trader who was in charge of cricket in my first spread betting job. And cricket was very important for spread betting. It was a really big market for the city. And he was incredibly smart, really understood betting markets, knew horse racing, knew greyhounds, incredible dogs, pricer, but knew cricket brilliantly. I don't think it's unfair to him, if he ever listens to this, he was not a huge punter in size, but the diligence, he just never half-assed it, ever. If he was going to have a bet on a race, he'd price it up without looking at the prices first, factor in everything. It was like, I'm so impatient and I'm basically lazy just watching him do this. That sort of said to me, like, and his, if you had his long-term, yield on his bets, we're talking a massive percent, he's an incredible margin winner. And it sort of showed me that, to be cavalier about stuff was, just, plot it carefully. And then you can have big bets if you've really gone through the motions of making sure you've got a good price. And then I would say, undoubtedly, the the owner of the joint owner of Gambit Research, who I had the pleasure of working with while I was at Mustard Systems doing golf betting. Again, longevity here is, he's been making fortunes in the betting industry for several decades now, and seemingly always adapts, always evolving, even if that means moving into businesses outside of sports betting, but applying the same principles of attributing value to certain things and so on. He undoubtedly is one of the most, and I remember having conversations with him where I would quite often throw out something that was maybe a bit off the cuff, like, oh, blatantly it should be like this. And he would pause, he'd have a think about it, and he'd say, oh, do you think maybe it'd be like this? And I'd be like, I would go, oh, okay. 3 days later, I'd be sat there thinking, shit, yeah, he's got it just right. That's exactly the way it should be. And, just to sort of have that level of instinctual knowledge of how to optimize your risk reward, and, how to approach any all betting markets to someone at that level become almost the same, whether it's the presidential election, Cheltenham Gold Cup, Rugby World Cup, you name it. Instinctively knowing which side the sharp money is going to be gravitating towards, he was an incredible person to work with. I suppose those those are two examples. I've got plenty really, but I don't want to use up the whole Q&A with it. But those are two good examples.
Okay, this is from. Sorry, carry on.
No, go ahead.
This is from Lee Horton, who would like to know how many genuine professional gamblers, in brackets not arbors, does he think there are in the UK, and what sports does he think they play?
So one thing we must establish, obviously, is that generally, by virtue of often taking best price, you are an arbor in terms of you have placed a bet that was in a market that was the state of arbitrage. So I assume when he wants to remove arbors, he means people who don't take any risk, basically, or match bettors, some people who back and then lay straight away on Betfair, or people who just always lock in the amount. So I assume then he's talking about professional gamblers who come up with their own prices and bet to them, or have a methodology or system that is proprietary to them that they use. And in terms of professional, well, it's funny, I had a discussion with someone the other day as to what point do you consider yourself a professional gambler? And he said, you've got to have been making money at it it's got to be your sole source of income for 3 years. And I said, okay, why 3 years specifically? And he said, because no one has the patience to put away more than 2 years worth of living expenses before going pro. So if you've made it for 3 years, by definition, you must be effectively a professional gambler. So how many of those people that meet all the criteria I've just described, I keep thinking the number must be tiny, like, less than 500. And then I seem to meet time and time again people who are in a period, at least in their lives, where they're making it pay. They may have been making it pay for 5 years or even 10 years. So I kind of it's kind of impossible for me to put a number on, really. And if you go on Twitter, it would seem that most of Britain is a pro punter. So it's really hard to make a call. One thing I do think is completely underestimated is the number of people out there who you don't hear about, who are just making a reasonable side income, betting small, just by doing their due diligence. I know these people exist simply because they were the people that we prayed we would be able to get us to ring up before we opened up the horse racing odds, and they would have their 25, 50 quid bets, knock us into shape, and then release the odds. Those people exist out there. They could be like in their 50s, 60s, watching horse racing their entire life, and you wouldn't call them pro punters because they're not doing it for a living. But if they scaled, you could consider them a professional gambler. I think there's more of those than we think. But yeah, it's really hard for me to put a number on it,
Okay.
Like I say, yeah.
Michael would like to know, what are the softest markets to bet into horse racing, and outside of the obvious dirty each ways and enhanced place terms for novice punters?
I mean, I think, people always talk about specialization with horse racing. There's too much horse racing to sort of cover everything. And I guess one of the obvious small groups was always like 2-year-old racing, generally was sort of like the the area. I'm going to say, and you can look at this for yourself. What is interesting is if you look at, I don't know if you're familiar with Adrian Massey's website, but he allows you to run a load of like queries on historical Betfair data to Betfair SP. And one thing I will say is that National Hunt Flat is not efficient yet. That is a fact. National Hunt Flat by syndicate, by Betfair SP closing is definitely not efficient. So I would definitely be targeting that personally if I was someone who was looking to not have to try and swallow the whole of racing whole and just look at a certain area to target. And yeah, that would be my, the fact that it's not yet efficient properly on Betfair suggests that even if you're banned at other places, you can potentially bet on the exchanges and have a good crack at it.